Disculpe, ¿quién nos avisaría cuándo comenzar?
Así es, en este momento estamos subiendo la señal en Facebook.
Muy
Eh,
bien.
Como le comentaba al doctor Humberto, les voy a hacer un conteo que consiste del 5 al 1, de un conteo regresivo. Cuando diga 1, me voy a quedar callado un momento. Vamos a hacer la transición a la sesión de Zoom y puede usted iniciar con la presentación del doctor. ¿Ya estamos en vivo, muchachos? Perfecto, estamos en vivo. En este momento les voy a dar el conteo regresivo. Entramos en 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Sean bienvenidos todos y todas los presentes que nos acompañan en el segundo Congreso Internacional y tercer Simposio Nacional sobre la prevención del suicidio y promoción de salud mental en niñas, niños y adolescentes. La verdadera educación consiste en obtener.
The true education consists in obtaining
El libro se puede estudiar
best
mejor.
a better book. Representing Dr. Humberto Nicolini Sánchez, Chief Psychiatrist and Investigator in Medical Sciences. Thank you very much for the presentation, and it's talking about suicidal conduct. We have to bear in mind talking about that we're talking about an broad aspect of genomics that go from the thoughts that are very personal, that are very difficult, to conducts that are sometimes that sometimes lead to the intention of suicide and clear intention to suicide that is consummated. Well, even if we know that there is a report about people suiciding, we still don't have a broad idea about it. We know there are about 1 million suicides a year, and the frequency varies related to about 1,000 suicides, according to the National Institute of Health. In Mexico, the prevalence of people trying to suicide is about 8%, 3.8%. from which about 99,700 people have used medical services related to suicide. About 593,600 people have tried it, and 6.6 million have somehow thought about it. According to the INEGI, in 2011, the suicides have been on and up. And currently, there have been about 7,000 suicides per year. This reflects somehow the effects of the bad effects that we have been having throughout the pandemic. Here we have a panoramic of 2014, 2015, where we made an investigation about the psychological effects, where we concluded that there was about 150 suicides per year. There is a lot of people who have some kind of comorbidity that leads to a psychiatric about half of the people that died to suicide had some kind of effect or some kind of effect through the chemistry of the brain that led them to, well, suicide. There are some kinds of suicide that we counted on, like shooting oneself, falling from for heights. We took an account also of some of the places of occurrence, like from home, public places, prison, etc. On the location, on a graphic place, we made a study throughout the different locations on Mexico City to see if it existed some kind of correlation with the between the delegations, principally to relate the rates of suicide throughout the city. Something interesting that we found out between the correlation of homicides and suicides. We found out that some of these delegations that are so pretty violent, we found out that there are some that are, well, more violent than others, like Milpa Alta. There are some that have a similar relation between homicide and suicide, like the Cuauhtémoc delegation. And well, some of these are some of that have some higher relation between drugs and alcohol and these kind of conducts. Another situation that we found out was that the death these are some of the places where we found more feminicides related, which we found out is very important. And it relates to all of that. It's quite curious that that all of this relates somehow to what we spoke about in the beginning about the chemistry in the brain relating to homicide or suicide. And there's this link between the geographic place where it happened. And there are some delegations that have a great quantity of hospitals, like Tlalpan, public hospitals. Let's say it had a rate that we expected that wasn't as low, even for suicide and homicide. And it gave access, but the access to medical services wasn't as we expected as a protective factor. Somehow the quantity of green spaces and related, as well as a kind of security and places, is related to lower rates. Here are some of the places that are related a bit more to alcohol and drugs, and related to suicides. There are some sites that attracts a lot more to people trying to suicide, especially in the city. There are some bridges, but overall, the public transport are some of the more dangerous places where people tend to go and commit suicide. Here, we made an analysis. This is a work where we expect to get out soon. These are some of the stations in the metro, and then some of the delegations where it occurred a higher rate of suicide. And we see that some of the tendations are the Gustavo Amadero, Álvaro Obregón, and Iztapalapa, where we have these spikes where there is a higher rate of suicide. We also find out that there is some kind of association with the selling of alcohol and drugs. Also, here in the part of suicides that happen, in particular, throughout the metro system, there was a lot of people that we found out in general that there was a lot of deaths by suicide. It was a high relation to psychiatric diseases they already had, and psychoactive substances, abuse of substances that somehow make the difference throughout the place. Here, the only difference was the place to suicide. It's a difficult, complex conduct where a lot of situations, a lot of aspects take place. There probably are different situations throughout life that take place. You know that there are some spikes throughout infancy and past 70 years old. There is another spike where a lot of suicides happen, and they somehow associate to events throughout the life, like losses in the family, economical losses, health issues that also affect. There are also cofactors, like many of them that are linked to are some kind of chemistry in the brain, like cortisol, which its regulation relates somehow to the stress, and it's fundamental. Like, as we know it, that happens in some psychiatric diseases. This is somehow a risk for the suicidal conduct to happen. The impulsivity of the neural circuit, the impulsive decisions that we make, are somehow associated to the taking of decisions, and all these points to the function of the area, the prefrontal area, that somehow acts as a brake that all affects the taking of decisions. All of this is somehow associated with the stress way. The study of neuropsychiatric diseases, the affective part, that all affects the transmission, and all of these mechanisms. We know also that there is an elevated variability, and well, it's frequent that in people which committed suicide, there are somehow other familiars that have had some kind of suicidal conduct or even have died through suicide. So family is a really important factor to take an account as an important part of the personal study of the patient. All of this points to that there is a big part for the personal history, in all of this. And through all of this, we can make some kind of prediction of risk or take account of the risk for all of these factors to affect and lead to somehow suicide kind of conduct. So knowing how the prefrontal cortex, through imaging and through genome variants, we can see and make some kind of prediction to see how the person can really go and take a suicide conduct. This can also relate throughout the environment to how it can relate to other kind of comorbidities and other kind of negative conducts that the patient can have, like drugs, alcohol, and it can result in a person committing suicide. So how can we know how in each person, how many of these factors are present, and have an estimate? of the neurobiological profile that everyone has to take into account as how much risk the person have to commit suicide. Well, there have been a lot of studies. For example, the serotonin way that where we found a lot of associations. The serotonin workflow is so complex. There are a lot of receptors, neurotransmitters, variants of all of these that regulate a lot of functions in the conduct of the person, like the impulsivity, the social interaction, the mood, the energy, and the interaction of many of these somehow affect the suicidal conduct. And they are being reported a lot in the scientific literature. All of these affects the aspects like the take of decisions, the energy, the mood, enjoying, the resilient capacity, the diversity, ways like the serotonin, the dopamine ways. These are some of the other molecules that are linked to the suicidal conduct. There are a lot of data that have been published through the Mexican Association that can somehow affect the dopaminergic way, the potassium, the transmission that the neurons make. All of these can affect the take of decisions as the filter, the breaks in this conduct. All of the ways of oxidation and oxygenation of the brain. These are pathways that are involved, and it's not a single molecule that can give that risk. How can we make an estimate of this risk if all of this can contribute some way for this conduct to happen? Well, we can develop some strategies that can make an evaluation of many of these genes. And one of these is the neurotypification chip that can allow us to make a lot of tests to evaluate these genes. We gather a lot of them in a single platform in these chips. And we can make an assessment, a genome assessment of them. And we can make an estimate of how many of these genes one person has that can be contributing to this suicidal conduct. This has been a part of some of the works, the statistic conclusion that some of these molecules have throughout all the pathways that we have been talked about, like cortisol, dopamine, serotonin, catecholamines, etc. Opioids, many of these different pathways and maybe we can assess that one of these pathways could be having higher or lower risk in the patient. For example, one of them, the cortisol, which is a stress hormone. We can make here we have a meta-analysis, and it has been known that just taking the cortisol as a factor, there's a lot of risk for suicidal conducts. The cortisol, for being the stress hormone, clearly is something that favors the suicide, but it's just a bit of information that explains this. In clinical level, even though we know that all of this gives a higher risk for suicide, we need to integrate a lot of knowledge of neurotypification, informatic analysis, sequencing, to make a better assessment of risk and have a more complex idea. We have also to take as an account the psychological effects, like in this image, where we can see either a cup or two faces, and how all of this affects the person. We can examine different systems and make an assessment of the risk to estimate with different pathways the risk that one has for suicidal tendencies. There have been some studies that directly study the brain, a dead brain, of someone who died from suicide, principally the prefrontal cortex and some other areas, to have a lot more information, places to study from. And somehow we can have this kind of signature from nature. This biological signature changes, and the signal is different that we are getting, and it separates from control when the person is affected or is taking some kind of drug or alcohol or psychoactive substances. And this makes a lot of difference between people who didn't really care for this kind of substances from the people who died and did take them. We can take these biological profiles and we get these maps, this multiple data from all of these molecules through all of these people who died from suicide, but who died from people who died from other causes. Even when we take epigenetic and take changes that don't really happen directly in the DNA, but rather through regulation of them, this has been really interesting. Let's say these changes are not hereditary, but rather changes that happen through our environments, like being abused as kids, the abuse of some substances, and so there are other biological routes where we find these differences and somehow lead through all of that. So we take this hereditary side and the epigenetic side. And then we can make another assessment for all of these data that are expressing. And we can see which one of all of these are affecting the person of interest. So we can see in some people that there is some kind of correlation between genetics and epigenetics, and somehow they join, and we then can predict how much of a risk one person has for suicidal conduct. We have seen that, for example, when the person is a carrier for many risk factors like schizophrenia, abuse of substances, dependency of channels, they give can give them a better hereditary or epigenetic expression for the person to get to a suicidal behavior. There are a lot of data today that gets us to through better studies that can give us a better idea of what factors are really behind these people that have a more vulnerability, and we can get a better idea of the probability of the person to commit suicide. We're still investigating these ways, these pathways, and where we can intervene through these biological ways, through biology, which can get us to better treatments for suicidal behavior, which drugs, what combination, what treatment, pharmacological treatment we can give for suicidal behavior. Let's say this model that we are talking about, like AI, can tell us like which pharmacological routes we can take. So it's really interesting. Like, for example, there are some drugs that are already out there, like ketamine, that somehow the AI detected as a drug as a drug for treatment for suicide. There are a lot of other drugs that are not even in this position for being used as a treatment for suicidal tendencies. There are a lot of them that are out there that we can use for this, but there are a lot of them that are not. This is interesting because through all of this, we can have a bigger space to work with a lot of tools that we can use to treat suicide. This can get us a better chance, not only as a diagnosis, but as a treatment for suicide, and we are still collaborating, investigating to keep studying this problem. We are opening a space for questions if you have them. Thank you very much. If there are not any questions, we are going. If anyone has any questions, please make them known through our transmission. Okay, I think there are no questions. Thank you very much.